Welcome to another United Soybean Board Checkoff Chat on Brownfield. I'm Kellen Havikin, an anchor and reporter with our network. And today's chat is featuring Brian Young, a professor of weed science with Purdue University. Brian, it's a pleasure to have you with us here on our USB Checkoff Chat. It's a topic that growers across the U.S. always have every year: herbicide resistance, weed issues, weed pressure. I'm curious, Brian, in your work, not only with Purdue University, but as a soybean farmer in general, what are some of the top issues when we talk herbicide resistance for farmers?
Well, certainly it gets down to some of the species that are causing us problems, such as water hemp and Palmer amaranth are probably the two biggest ones. Mare's tail, some might call it horseweed, is another big issue. And, we don't want to blame all of it on they're resistant to Roundup or glyphosate, but we have all sorts of other types of herbicide modes of action that they're resistant to as well. So it's particular species that keep on germinating, are very prevalent, and they're resistant to multiple herbicide modes of action. That's where the problem starts.
Well, I know the United Soybean Board has developed their Take Action program, which helps farmers and gives them additional tools to kind of fight these weed pressures and insects. Tell me more about this Take Action program and how growers can essentially diversify what they're using to fight these things.
Certainly. Well, fortunately, I've been involved with this Take Action initiative ever since it started with USB. And the whole idea is we just can't lay back and let the weeds dictate or the pests dictate what we do. We have to dictate to the pest. And so we have to take action in terms of using more than one pesticide to control, or one mode of action to control the particular pest. We need multiple modes of action, multiple strategies. It doesn't have to all be chemical management of some of these pests. We have non-chemical tools, cultural practices such as cover cropping systems, maybe it's row spacing, seeding rate, different tools that we can integrate to be more effective at managing some of these problematic weeds.
Well, let's talk about what should a herbicide program look like in 2023 for growers?
Well, in 2023, we have a suite of herbicides that we have to choose from. Many of those we have weeds that are resistant to. Now, even though we have weeds resistant to a specific herbicide, doesn't mean that it's useless. Let's take glyphosate for an example. It still controls a lot of other weeds that are present in our fields, maybe just not some of the primary ones we're having trouble with, such as water hemp or horseweed. So we can still use some of the core herbicides that we have in the past, but we need to incorporate other herbicides. And a lot of those happen to be the soil residual herbicides that stop weeds before they emerge out of the soil, because they represent different modes of action than some of our post-emergence herbicides. And we tend to fail more commonly with our post herbicides. That's just been the track record of failure for resistance over the last 20, 30 years. So we need to make sure that some of these weeds don't come up and we can overlap the residuals, which is possibly a concept that we'll talk about a little bit further.
Yeah, and I know this is part of the Take Action Inside Weed Management video series that are available to growers. One of those, we kind of just talked about maximizing the effectiveness of residual herbicides, but I also want to talk about, you mentioned it, post-emergence weed control. What does that look like now, but also what's that look like in the future?
Well, right now we're looking at herbicide combinations. So it might be if you're in Extend soybeans or Enlist soybeans, you might be using dicamba or 2,4-D. It might be Liberty Link and you're using Liberty herbicide. You might still have glyphosate in that mix. So in some cases, I hear 2 to 3-way mixes for some of the primary weeds when you're going after a single weed species. When you have things like volunteer corn in there as well, we might have a 4th herbicide. And then we're using certain adjuvant systems that are specific to that tank mix combination that you're using. And while we're doing this, we're managing spray drift. So there's a lot of things to think about in some of our post-emergence applications today. 10 years from now, what does that look like? I think we're still using some of these herbicide mixtures. In some ways, my hope is that this post-application is no longer the main form of weed management. We're using it to clean up some of the escapes that we have from early season weed management strategies. And so the post application is just a cleanup. I don't want to call it a rescue, but it's only controlling maybe 10 to 20% of our weed population on that acre, in that field, in that year. so that we don't over rely on these post herbicides.
Another video that's included in this series has to do with the equipment that farmers use. And being an agriculture person and growing up on a farm, I feel like this is potentially something that we don't talk a lot about, especially like tanks and mixing chemicals. Within that, what can you tell us about this when it comes to your overall management program?
Well, there's been some things that we want to do for improving weed management, such as these herbicide combinations, but for one way or another, they don't play very well in the tank together. So maybe we're going to have a situation where there are some spray systems out there right now where you have two tanks and two spray booms on one spray rig. And that allows you to add certain pesticides in each of the tanks that applied separately, even though they're essentially hitting the leaf almost simultaneously, they behave better applied in that manner than in the same spray solution. So you can look at different adjuvants in each tank to optimize them, different carrier volumes, different droplet sizes to optimize some of these herbicide combinations. So I think that's one thing, the two tank system. And then also in the future, we're going to have what we would call targeted sprays. So you're only spraying the weeds that are up, and if you don't have a weed up, it's going to save that spray. So possibly save you on the post-emergence herbicide application bill if you don't have weeds up. How do we get to that point where we don't have weeds up at the post timing? Use those soil residual herbicides that we talked about. So they're going to be even more critical 10 years from now than they are today.
Ryan, let me ask you this question. When you have talked with farmers, and even when you've done this in your operation, uh, what are some tank errors, or what are some things farmers should be avoiding when they get to that part in this?
Well, I'll be honest. I've done a lot of work with the pesticide adjuvants that might be used. So they're not the active ingredients, the pesticides themselves, but the other things you put in the tank to make them work better. That market is a little bit confusing in terms of the education and some of the product claims. So, I know there are some situations where somebody's put something in a tank and I said, well, what'd you do that for? That has a drift control agent in it. You just made your droplets a lot bigger and you're applying a contact herbicide. You need good coverage with smaller droplets. I didn't even know that had it in there. I just thought it was straight ammonium sulfate. No, that has a drift control agent in there too. So I think, you know, we're going to have to learn more about what we're putting in that tank, some of the chemistry, know how to optimize these. And that means that what we do post-emergence isn't just something that we learned about yesterday and spray tomorrow. It's something that we think about during the winter season. What is my plan A? What is my plan B for my post applications? And adjuvants just shouldn't be an afterthought. They should be part of the weed control system just as much as some of the pesticides that we're putting in the tank.
Now, we've talked about post-emergence, we've talked about tank issues, we've talked a lot of what these videos and USB's Take Action program series has, but the last thing we really haven't discussed is our weed management for early planted soybeans. Tell me more about that.
Well, that creates a little bit of an issue for us, a little bit of a challenge. So we're doing some research in a couple different ways on the ultra early planted soybeans, where if we take the common recommendations that we have today and use a full rate of 2 different soil residual herbicides to control that water hemp, that first flush, well, water hemp might not emerge for another 30 days because we're planting those soybeans so early. Let's say the first part of April, and maybe your water hemp doesn't come up until the first week of May. And your soybeans are going to take longer to germinate, longer to emerge, and that means they're going to be exposed to that herbicide in the soil for a longer period of time under cooler conditions. So there's a chance that some of these herbicides might impart a little bit more injury to the soybeans if we use that same chemistry. So we're looking at different things where maybe we change the chemistry so that's not quite as injurious for these early soybean applications, and looking to see how planting green into a cover crop might reduce the need for some of those herbicides that we would normally recommend because of that biomass they develop. But what we found out so far is planting green and planting early create some challenges to get a good soybean stand sometime under those cooler conditions.
And Brian, you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you helped kind of develop the Take Action program series, and we covered essentially the highlights of what some of these videos include. Give me an overview, maybe an anecdotal comment about these video series And really, what does this mean? How does this help farmers be more successful in this area?
Well, the idea behind Take Action is to provide some nuggets of information that we already have information in the extension channels in weed management or pest management, or a lot of it has to do with some research that we've done more recently, funded by USB, that we want to get out to the users. So it'd be the crop consultants and the soybean farmers, of course. And so it's a combination of both those. So timely information put out there through different means, but also another way for us to share our research findings instead of just doing it locally within our state. We're trying to do it more on a national platform through USB and the Take Action project.
How important is it to have essentially what I'm hearing is kind of like a central hub location for all of this information that's been researched and a different way to disseminate it? How important is it to have it in one place for farmers since there's so many different pieces that have to go in relation to this?
Well, that's one thing I'm proud of the most, is having all these weed scientists involved in the Take Action project and all the scientists doing some of the research, that we come together, we have some deliverables, fact sheets on weed growth and development, fact sheets on how to manage some of these important weeds, and we have a unified voice. So it's not where 15 years ago we had one group was saying, we'll do this for weed management, another group saying something slightly different, and then you might have some from industry saying, well, forget about those other modes of action, use this mode of action, and use these beans, by the way, too. So I think the huge benefit is that it represents a unified voice, because industry is part of Take Action as well, in terms of the pesticide manufacturers. They have input in some of these recommendations. Universities do, is based off research, based off experience, that we're delivering this to the growers. So hopefully it's what we would call one-stop shopping in terms of getting the information they need to manage some of these pests.
Ryan, if growers are interested about learning more about USBA's Take Action program, where can they get that information at?
iwilltakeaction.com should come up pretty easily in a Google search. And they just have revised that website, my understanding. So hopefully they can find the information that we have provided.
That's Brian Young, professor of weed science with Purdue University. Brian, thank you so much for bringing on our United Soybean Board Checkoff Chat this week.
All right. Thank you so much, Kellen.
Thanks again to Brian Young. I'm Kellen Havikin, and this has been another USB Checkoff Chat with Brownfield.